Hello and welcome to Module 9, which deals with crew management. This is just a short presentation where we look at the human element in shipping. Essentially, we are looking at seafarers here. Because if you think about it, the safety and efficiency of shipping to a large extent depends on the quality as well as the competence of seafarers. Now, the standards of crew competence, they are laid down by the International Maritime Organization, IMO. On the other hand, the standards for crew welfare and their living conditions and work conditions are set by the International Labour Organization, or ILO. So in this module, we will look at the ways that these standards are being met by ship's crews and ship managers. So we have two focus questions here. First of all, what are the standards of work and behavior for seafarers and how these standards are met? And we'll also look at the obligations of shipping companies towards the ship's crews. So for a start, what we'll do first of all is look at the conventional ship organization to see how the seafarers are organized on board a ship. And this is the conventional or traditional way. Essentially, the crew members are organized under the deck department as well as the engine department. There could be a separate catering department, and by the way, I should mention I'm talking about cargo ships here. Of course, on a passenger ship you will have a very large number of hospitality staff as well. So essentially, in the deck department, if you look at the deck department, they are concerned with the navigation and communications. These are the external communications of the ship, say with the shipping company, port authorities, etc. Also, this is the department that's involved in handling of cargo. The engine department is the one that is responsible for the machinery operation on the ship, and we are talking here about not only the propulsion machinery but also the hotel services like provision of hot water, etc. They are also responsible for maintenance and repairs. Having said that, some of the maintenance like painting of the ship's decks and so on would fall under the deck department. The master is traditionally comes from the deck department. Even if the master is an engineer, they would still need to have the competencies that are specified for master in the deck department. Now, in Australia, we've got a Navigation Act of 2012, and that, according to that act, the master is a person who has command, or in other words, charge of ship. Basically, the master bears the ultimate responsibility for the safe navigation as well as the efficient loading, stowage and discharge of cargo for the crew. The master, as far as the rest of the crew is concerned, represents the owner. There is a wide authority that is vested in the master under maritime law, and what the master does within the scope of his or her authority is actually binding on the owner of the ship. So that's why the master's responsibility or master's position is so important. Now, within the deck department itself, the master would be supported by a number of what are often called mates. So there's the chief mate, second mate, third mate, also a trainee cadet. On the engine side, you will have the chief engineer, followed by the first, or some people call them second engineer, third engineer, fourth engineer, and so on. These people would be termed what we would call officers on a ship, whereas the crew or the ratings would be they could either be organized under deck or engine department, or as happens often these days, they are integrated. In other words, they could be called upon to work both in the deck, or either in the deck or in the engine department. The person who is directly responsible for supervision of the ratings is often commonly referred to as the bosun. In Australia, that person is called the chief integrated rating, because in Australia the ratings are not classified as either deck or engine, but rather they are integrated. So that's why their chief is known as the chief integrated rating. So I suppose it leads us to the next question, and that is, how many crew seafarers are required to be on a ship? Well, the short answer to that is decided by the regulators of the flag state. And essentially the regulators will issue a ship with a safe manning certificate, which will specify the number of crew and what they must do on board the ship. So generally speaking, in deciding the minimum number of crew on a ship, they would look at the basic principles as highlighted on this slide here. First of all, there should be sufficient crew so that they can maintain safe navigational, engine room and radio watch. What do we mean by watch? I'll show you, I'll talk about it in the next slide, but essentially what that means is that at any given time the ship should be watched over by someone. So when the ship is at sea, you don't stop the ship and everybody goes to sleep. That doesn't happen. So 24 hours somebody is keeping a watch on the ship. So you need to have sufficient number of people to perform 24-hour watch. The other principle that determines the minimum number of crew is that the crew should be able to perform all the safety functions on board a ship. So if you look at the picture on the left hand side of the slide here, you can see a few people being trained to fight fire. That's a picture from the AMC's own firefighting center, by the way. And the ship's crew is not only the crew on board the ship, but they are also the fire brigade, because in case something goes wrong, such as fire, they are the ones who have to fight the fire. So there needs to be sufficient people who can deal with the emergencies while still maintaining control of the ship. That's related also to the maintenance of the ship and machinery in a safe working condition as well. So you should always have enough people so that the ship can be operated in a safe manner. Now, ships are big things and they need to be tied to the jetty. That involves manual handling of very big and heavy mooring ropes. So you require a few people to tie the ship to the berth and untie it when it has to depart. And so the requirements for mooring and unmooring of ship, it basically means here tying and untying of the ship to a jetty. That would also affect safe manning levels. And finally, there should be sufficiently trained people who can provide medical care. So we are talking about not only first aid but a little bit beyond that as well. So in a typical ocean going ships, you might find 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 people on a normal cargo ship. Of course the numbers can vary. Now in the previous slide I was talking about watches. What do we mean by watch? So here I'll give you an example of a navigational watch, because these days on modern ships, in the engine room you don't keep manual, as in somebody being present and sitting inside the engine room type watch. Similarly, you don't have radio operators, unless perhaps on passenger ships, who would be sitting there and listening to the radio. The watches that would be carried out on the 24-hour watches, I beg your pardon, that would be carried out on the modern cargo ships would be carried out by the deck officers and deck people on the wheelhouse or the bridge of the ship. So a typical organization would be where from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning, it's the second mate who's in charge on the ship's bridge. The 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the morning watch is kept by chief mate, and that's a good time because chief mate is responsible for the day-to-day organization and running of the ship's deck department. So that's a good time to liaise with the bosun, for example, and work out what needs to be done during the day. The third mate keeps the 8 to 12 watch, and the whole thing is repeated during daytime as well. So from noon to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the watch would be kept by second mate, 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 o'clock in the night by chief mate, and so on. Now usually when the ship is out at open sea, the only person keeping the watch from the wheelhouse would be be one of the mates, and we refer to that person as officer of the watch. In the night time, however, the officer of the watch would have a rating who would be keeping the navigational watch or assisting in keeping the navigational watch as well. During the daytime, there would be one rating who would be available to be called quickly to the wheelhouse in case there's a need for a second person. So that person might be, say, in contact with the mate on watch via walkie-talkie, but in the night time there would always be one rating with the officer of the watch in the wheelhouse. Now this is the minimum number. When the ship is passing through critical areas such as entering harbors and ports, passing through busy passages like Malacca Strait, there could be additional people. Sometimes weather situation deteriorates so that there might be a lot of fog, so just to have an extra pair of eyes, as well as also to listen to signals made by other vessels, like other vessels would be blowing their foghorns, you might have additional persons on board. In many ports of the world, pilotage is compulsory, which means you need to take on board a specialist who knows the local port very well, and that pilot would be additional to the watch as well. By the way, having said that, as a general rule, the presence of pilot on board does not relieve the ship's master or any of the officers or other people of their responsibility to maintain the ship in a safe condition all the time. Now, what do these watchkeepers do when they perform a watch? Essentially, all the deck officers perform similar functions when they are keeping a watch. There are essentially two key tasks, two critical tasks while performing a watch. First of all, the officer of the watch has to ensure that the ship stays on its intended track. That means it's not a simple case of pointing the ship's head in the intended direction, because the ship can move sideways under the influence of currents and wind, because the ship is not on solid ground, and you hope it's not on the solid ground, but sometimes it does happen that the ship drifts and runs aground, and the picture on the left hand side shows you a ship that is broken into two because it ran aground. So what the officer of the watch needs to know at any given time is the position of the ship. Now, near the coast, the position can be fixed with the help of land features, lighthouses and so on. Out in the open sea, traditionally navigators have relied on the sun, moon, stars and planets. These days, of course, the global position system, or GPS, which many of you would be using on your mobile phones, is widely used for position fixing. Having said that, under international rules, deck officers are still required to be trained in conventional navigation methods, including the use of celestial bodies like sun, moon, stars and planets. The second important watchkeeping task is avoiding collisions with other ships or structures. So if you think about it, a ship does not have brakes, so even if the engines are stopped, the ship's momentum can carry a considerable distance. There are international rules, traffic rules, that ship must follow in order to avoid collision with other ships, but at sea, if you think about it, no two situations are ever the same, and if there is a risk of collision, there is considerable judgment is required on the part of the officer of the watch to make the correct decision. Otherwise, you may have a collision such as the T-bone shown on the picture on the right hand side. Now, with the increase in technology and sophistication of ships, and also the fact that the stakeholders, the society in general, does not take very kindly to incompetent ship's crew, the training of seafarers has become very, very important, more important today than ever before. Of course, in an international situation, the problem arises that how do you have acceptable standards on ships that belong to different countries, and how do you make sure that each country is training its seafarers to the same standards. And so to ensure internationally accepted standards and levels of training and qualifications, the IMO set up a convention called the STCW Convention, which is the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers. And this convention originally took place in '78. It went through some major changes in 1995 and 2010. Essentially what it does is it lays down competency standards at three levels. So those three levels are the management level, operational level and support level. So the management level competency standards are for people such as the master, chief mate, the chief engineer and the second engineer. The operational level standards are those for people who keep watches. So these would be watches or similar levels. So these would be for people who perform duties such as second mate, third engineer, fourth engineer. And finally, you have got competency standards for people who support the people who are carrying out their work at the operational or management level. So the ratings, for example, would need to comply with the competency standards that are laid down for the support level. Now, all seafarers need to be licensed, and depending upon their level, at the management and operational level, certainly they would be having certificates to show that they are licensed, and those certificates are known as certificates of competency. Now, where does the shipping company sit in all of this? Well, in the STCW convention, shipping companies are required to accept various responsibilities and obligations. These could be explicit or implicit. Explicit responsibilities are essentially the direct responsibilities of shipping companies, and they are largely derived from relevant provisions in the IMO International Safety Management Code, or ISM code, that I will deal with in the last couple of modules in this unit. So the main requirements are that each seafarer has to hold the appropriate certificate to perform that job. So if you want to employ a master, the master should be certified to work as master on a ship. As far as manning is concerned, the ship should be manned in accordance with the safe manning requirements of the regulator of the flag state. In terms of record keeping, the shipping company has to have documentation and data relevant to the seafarer, and it has to keep that documentation detailing things such as training, experience, medical fitness, and competency in assigned duties. As far as familiarization goes, the company has to ensure that seafarers are familiarized with their specific duties and with all ship arrangements, installations, procedures, equipment, and ship characteristics that are relevant to their routine or emergency duties. Ship's crew need to be able to effectively coordinate activities in an emergency situation, and also in performing functions which are vital to the safety of the ship or pollution prevention. So in other words, regular drills and musters of the crew to practice crew coordination in emergency procedures need to be carried out. There are of course some implicit obligations as well, and these basically STCW contains these additional implicit obligations to ensure that seafarers are trained, qualified, and certified in accordance with the requirements which are specified elsewhere in the STCW convention and may not necessarily refer to the company directly. Having said that, although governments are responsible for implementing and enforcing the STCW requirements, companies have to make sure that the seafarers they employ are qualified in accordance with the international standards. So those standards relate to familiarization with safety matters, what to do in an emergency, and this is not only for people who hold certificates of competency but all persons, such as on a passenger ship you're talking about cooks, entertainers, shopkeepers. They also need to be familiarized with what to do in an emergency. There needs to be basic training for those people who have designated safety or pollution prevention duties. On passenger ships, special training may be required to be provided to the people who work on board. For example, in case of an emergency, you might require people who can direct or herd passengers to a particular direction, and so that's the sort of special training that would be needed on passenger ships. Special training is also needed for working on tankers. As far as the radio duties are concerned, the International Telecommunications Union has got regulations about protocols and routine and emergency procedures involving radio communications. So people need to be trained to do that. In the past, dedicated radio operators used to do that on cargo ships. They might still do on passenger ships, but on cargo ships now those radio related duties are carried out by the deck officers, but they need to have appropriate certificates to show that they are trained to perform these duties. In terms of English language, the officer of the watch, of a navigational watch, needs to know written and spoken English so that that person can read navigational charts and communicate with outsiders as well. Engineers should be able to read instruction manuals. Officers at the management level should also know about the flag states laws, because if you think about it, if the ship is flying, let's say, the Australian flag, Australian laws apply on that ship. So the management level officers, that's the master, chief mate, chief engineer, the second engineer, they need to be aware of the flag states maritime law. As far as drug and alcohol policy is concerned, now IMO does provide advice, and their recommendation advisory is maximum 0.08 blood alcohol concentration during watch, and no taking of alcohol 4 hours prior to keeping a watch. And it talks about having, the advice is to have screening programs for drugs and alcohol as well. Having said that, there is nothing stopping individual companies, and many of them do have zero tolerance for alcohol and drugs. There are sometimes additional certificates required for higher than just the basic training. For example, some seafarers would require to have advanced knowledge of firefighting or operating a survival craft, such as you can see some of the AMC students on the slide on the top left hand side of the slide. Let's look at some ownership and flag details of the shipping companies, and there are two images here. The one on the left hand side shows you ships of, or is based on data of ships of 1,000 gross tons and above, whereas the one on the right is about ships of 100 gross tons and above. They are both taken from the Untied Review of Maritime Transport 2013, and both of them rank various countries or flags on the basis of deadweight tonnage. So if you look at the left hand slide, you can see that owners from 5 countries, Greece, Japan, China, Germany and the Republic of Korea, they are the top 5 ship owning countries in the world. As far, this is in relation to the deadweight tonnage, okay? And although the slide or the image shows you number of vessels, but the ranking is actually based on deadweight. In terms of vessel numbers, of course, the largest ship owning country is China. Having said that, from a registration, I should mention those top 5 countries I just mentioned, Greece, Japan, China, Germany and Republic of Korea, they account for more than half of the world's deadweight tonnage. From a registration perspective, most of the ship owning countries have more than half of the tonnage under a foreign flag. And if you look at the right hand side image, the 5 largest fleets by flag of registration in January 2013, and in terms of the deadweight, were number 1 was Panama, followed by Liberia, followed by the Marshall Islands, Hong Kong, China and Singapore. Now what's been happening in recent years is that the traditional distinction between national flag fleets and open registers is getting blurred. There are many flags now that could be considered purely open, as you know, they might have less than 2% of the ships flying their flags that belong to owners who reside in that country. At the other end of the scale, there are flags that are used almost exclusively by owners from that country, and perhaps these could be termed the purely national flags, and examples of those would be countries such as Vietnam and India. In between the extremes, there are flags which are used by both national and foreign owners. So if we take the case of Philippines, for example, or the Philippines flag, for example, the Philippine flag is used 3 times more by foreigners than Philippine nationals. According to the Untied Review of Maritime Transport, in January 2013, a record share of 73% of the world fleet was flagged out. What do we mean by that? means that the nationality of the ship's owner was different from the flag under which the ship was registered. Now, one interesting thing you might observe is that the ship registers often specialize in different ship types and countries of ownership. So, say for example, the flag of Antigua and Barbuda, that's not in the slide here, but it's one of the major flags. The flag of Antigua and Barbuda, that's mostly used by ship owners who are from Germany. The register of Bahamas, for example, is quite popular with ship owners from Canada, Greece and Norway. The Cyprus and Liberian flags are very popular with Greek and German owners, and almost half, nearly half of the Panamanian deadweight tonnage is Japanese owned. Turning our attention to seafarers, now the worldwide population of seafarers which are serving on merchant ships that trade internationally is estimated, according to one estimate, as 624,000 officers and 747,000 ratings. I should warn you though that this is just an estimate, and I have come across different numbers as well. But if you look at the trends, you could say that the OECD countries, which is North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, etc., they do still remain an important source for officers. Having said that, a growing number of officers also come from the Far East and Eastern Europe. The majority of the shipping industry's ratings, they come from developing countries, especially the Far East and Southeast Asia. The Philippines and India are very significant maritime labor supply countries. China has also seen a large increase in the number of seafarers, but most of these, presently anyway, they work on the Chinese fleet, so they are engaged in meeting the domestic requirements. In recent years, Eastern Europe has also become an important supplier of seafarers, and a large number come from countries such as Ukraine, Croatia and Latvia. The other major labor supply countries include Greece, Japan, Russia and the United Kingdom. So since we're talking about seafarers, what about the work environment of seafarers? There are certain trends, not all of them welcome trends, that can be observed in recent years in the work and living conditions of seafarers. First of all, there is the reduction in crew sizes. What that means is that there is more responsibility being placed on individuals. Changes in ship technology means that there is more productivity expected from seafarers. Ships are spending less and less time in port, so there are shorter turnaround times in port, which means there is less time available for seafarers for rest and relaxation. There is also increasingly lack of access to welfare services. For example, due to security issues, certain nationalities may not be allowed to go ashore when the ship is in port without, a big rigmarole of paperwork and so on. There is increased use of multinational crews. What that means is it creates isolation. So, a seafarer might be the only nationality among a crew of 20, and so they feel very isolated. For cost cutting, there is always the pressure to recruit poorly trained and poorly qualified crews, which means it creates pressure on those who are better qualified or are in position of responsibility. The work in terms of procedural duties has increased because, in addition to carrying out the tasks which the seafarers of yesteryears used to carry out, these days modern seafarers have to be concerned with security related tasks as well. Increasingly there are longer tours of duty, which means greater isolation, people miss their home and family life, etc. And as I mentioned in last week's module, there is also the effect of the criminalization of seafarers. Now, It's interesting to think about the life of seafarers, and the most dangerous risk to the seafarer is not from collisions, fires, explosions or falling cargo, but it's actually from social conditions on board the ship, which lead to things such as suicide, homicide and overdose. And the social fatality group, unfortunately, or until very recently, was the most ignored previously. Previously, most of the international effort was on technical things like crew competence, but the what or rather, or let me correct that by saying that in the past there had been lots of attempts, particularly by ILO, to have more desirable social conditions on board the ship, but there was no mechanism to enforce those. Some would argue that as far as the safety or crew safety is concerned, the largest potential can come through an improvement in social conditions rather than simply relying on technical competence standards from IMO. Now, unfortunately, there is a record of some flag states failing to implement the standards that were set by ILO and IMO, and as a result there have been many cases of seafarers being exposed to exploitation, mistreatment, being exposed to dangerous work practices, so not being provided with safety gear, which results in seafarers working in a very fatigue, in an environment that creates a lot of fatigue, and seafarers not being fed properly, and in many cases seafarers have not been paid for their work, or in case the shipping company has gone bankrupt, they have been abandoned in a foreign port with really no way to support themselves or even to go back home. And it is in this environment that the International Labour Organization, or ILO, has stepped in recently in a big way through a convention known as the Maritime Labour Convention, or MLC 2006. Before I get to that, just a word on ILO. What is ILO? ILO is a specialized agency of United Nations, and what it tries to do is to promote decent work conditions around the world. It was founded in 1919, I beg your pardon, that is 1919, and Australia was a founding member. So ILO has two sides to its activities. It, in consultation with the shipping employer groups as well as the union groups, sets international labor standards and also provides technical assistance in the form of aid to some of the developing countries, so they can, they are provided help and expertise so that they can enforce and implement labor standards on board the ships flying their flags as well. Now, seafarers have always been of special concern to the ILO, and about 20% of the ILO's, that is 1/5 of ILO's work, is actually dedicated to seafarers. ILO Maritime Convention and recommendations cover many subjects, and many subjects which are directly relevant to the conditions of work and life of seafarers. Now, in recent years, ILO has worked quite a lot to develop a convention called the Maritime Labour Convention 2006, or MLC 2006. Now, why did it need to come up with a new convention? It did have many existing conventions, but many of them were really not relevant to 21st century shipping, and also there was no provision for enforcement. There was a lot of confusion with the number of conventions, and so this new convention consolidates many of the previous instruments and modernizes them as well. One important thing that this convention does is it introduces a level playing field. What do we mean by that? It means that bad ship owners can't get away with poor work conditions on board the ships, whereas in the past they could cut down their costs by providing not providing good working conditions, but now they can't. So that means there is a level playing field for shipping companies that put a lot of emphasis on crew welfare. The Maritime Labour Convention also includes fundamental human rights. Basically, there are 4 of them, which means that all seafarers have freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. There is elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor. There is effective abolition of child labor and as well as the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. The MLC Convention is sometimes referred to as the fourth pillar of regulation, together with IMO's SOLAS, MARPOL and STCW Convention, because these four conventions are the biggest conventions that affect the regulation of ships. So what do we find in MLC 2006? Essentially, there are 5 major titles, in other words 5 major areas that MLC covers. So the first one is the minimum requirements for seafarers to work on a ship, and that's done to ensure that no underage people work on a ship, that all seafarers are actually medically fit to perform their duties at sea, and they are trained and qualified to carry out their duties on board a ship. Title 2, which deals with condition of employment, has been designed to ensure that seafarers have a fair employment agreement, that they are paid for what work they do, they have regulated hours of work, and they do get hours of rest as well. They get leave, and once they finish their tour of duty, they are able to return home. Title 3 deals with accommodation, recreational facilities, food and catering, and basically the purpose of those regulations are to ensure that seafarers have a decent and clean accommodation and recreational facilities on board, and they also have access to good quality food and drinking water, which is provided under hygienic conditions. Title 4, which deals with health protection, medical care, welfare and social security protection, has been designed to ensure that seafarers get prompt access to Medicare care, whether they are on board ship or ashore when the ship is alongside in a port or in a port. So, and seafarers are protected from the financial consequences of sickness, injury or death if it occurs in connection with their employment. This Title 4 is also designed to promote occupational health and safety on board the ships, and it also provides for seafarers having access to social security protection. Title 5 is about compliance and protection, and it's about making sure that each country implements its responsibility under the MLC, either due to the fact that it's a flag state, or either due to the fact that it is the port state. And this title also deals with certain issues relating to seafarers recruitment and the social protection of seafarers. The whole MLC system relies on inspections in port and certificates that are issued to ensure compliance. So in that respect, it is just like the IMO conventions. Now, for the large majority of seafarers, especially the one who come from developing countries, the employment conditions at sea in most cases comfortably exceed those that they can obtain in shore-based employment at home. Apart from general conditions of work, the wage rates for most of the world's offices and ratings are quite generous in comparison with pay rates for similar occupations for people who don't go out to sea but stay ashore. In addition, in many countries, seafarers' wages, they are not subject to taxes such as income tax. Often wages are paid in US dollars, which is a bonus for certain countries. Now, ILO has adopted a minimum monthly wage for the rating grade of what it calls an AB. AB is an able-bodied seaman or able seaman, and this is a recommendation from ILO, but it does form the basis for seafarers' wage rates in many collective agreements. As you would expect, wages paid to seafarers from developed countries are usually far in excess of the ILO minimum, and even for majority of seafarers from developing countries that are employed by international shipping companies, the major shipping companies, they would get wages far in excess of the minimum ILO wage. Now, before I talk about the minimum wage, how is it determined? Basically, it's determined periodically through meetings between a joint maritime commission of ILO as well as members of the International Shipping Federation, which is an organization made up of or which represents the ship owners' interest, and the International Transport Workers Federation or ITF, which represents the interests of the unions. The ILO minimum wage only refers to the basic monthly wage, excludes overtime, leave and other payments. So a few years ago, I think it might have been 2010 if I'm not mistaken, the minimum basic wage for an able seafarer was US dollars 545 per month. So this was the basic wage, but in addition, seafarers also may earn overtime, leave and other payments, and the minimum basic wage for an AB, for example, would include or in addition to the minimum basic wage, there would be a leave pay of not less than 2.5 days per month based on a 30-day month, and there is an overtime compensation based on 1.25 times the normal hourly rate. So if we take this example of US dollars 545, there are some calculations done that show that the AB would actually have a consolidated monthly wage of about $1,033. Now these minimum wages are updated periodically. So from 1st of January 2015, the minimum wage would be, the basic wage would be US dollars 592. So this just gives you an indication of what is considered the minimum acceptable standard as far as the wages are concerned. But like I said, I mentioned in the previous slide, international shipping companies would more often than not pay their crew more than the minimum wage, but not everybody does that. Now as far as the seafarers' employment agreements are concerned, they would be having a formal employment contract. It would include things such as length of employment, details of repatriation. In other words, when they finish their tour of duty, if the ship is in another port and not their home port, how do they get back home, details about salary, work conditions, and also the expected standards of conduct. For example, in the employment agreement on the slide, and you might not be able to read because the print is very small, this paragraph 2 says that each seafarer will be orderly, faithful, honest and sober, and will at all times diligent when performing duties and obedient to the lawful commands of superior officers and the master, etc., etc. Some agreements, and certainly in the past many agreements, used to refer to a code of conduct. So the picture here is of an old Australian Merchant Navy code of conduct, and you can see it's dated 1995. And while there may not be any requirement nowadays to have a code of conduct in the agreement, I wanted to put the slide up so that if you look at the contents in the index, that gives you an indication of the type of issues that are dealt with as far as the crew behavior is concerned, because these are the items of crew behavior that are considered crucial or very important to the safe and efficient operation of the ship. So for example, things about punctuality, not leaving the ship in in an unauthorized manner, the drug and alcohol policy, behavior towards others, etc., etc. So these are sort of the, I suppose this gives you an indication of what typically the crew agreements contain. That sort of brings me to the last slide. So essentially what we have done is we've looked at the duties and responsibilities of the crews with reference mainly to the STCW convention. We have also looked at the explicit and implicit responsibilities of the shipping companies towards seafarers. We've looked at some areas of concern as far as the crew welfare is concerned and what's been happening in recent years, the trends in recent years which are impacting negatively on crew welfare. And that was perhaps one of the main reasons, not the only, but one of the main reasons why the ILO came up with the Maritime Labour Convention of 2006. That's all for this module. In the next module we will look at the role of shipping and its impact on the environment. Bye for now.